kitchen smells reach you first, wood smoke curling up from the hearth, the earthy sweetness of barley bread baking in hot ashes, a whisper of dried herbs hanging from the rafters above. Steam rises from a clay pot nestled among the coals, carrying with it the scent of cabbage and leeks mingling with something richer, meatier perhaps, though you cannot quite place it. Outside, the day is ending, darkness settling over the thatched roofs like a wool blanket. But here, in this small dwelling with its packed earth floor and single room warmed by the fire, there is comfort. There is food. The wooden spoon scrapes against the pot's curved side, and you wonder, what did medieval peasants truly eat? Not the gruel and misery of old stories, but the real meals that filled their wooden bowls and sustained bodies that laboured from sunrise to sunset. Let us sit together by this fire and discover what simmered in those clay pots, what rose golden from communal ovens, what nourished the hands that built cathedrals and tilled the fields of Europe for 1,000 years. But before that, comment on which country you're watching this video from. The pot hangs heavy over the hearth, suspended from an iron chain that loops around a sturdy oak beam. Inside, something has been simmering since morning, and it will simmer still when the sun rises again tomorrow. This is pottage, and if there is one dish that tells the story of how medieval peasants ate better than we might think, this is it. Not because it was simple or sparse, though sometimes it was both. Not because it was the food of desperation, though in lean times it kept starvation at bay. No, pottage tells the story because it was the centre of daily life, the rhythm of the hearth, the vessel into which generations of knowledge and care were poured alongside water and whatever the season offered. The word itself comes from the French, meaning simply food cooked in a pot, but this straightforward name conceals an extraordinary range. A pottage might be thin as broth, or thick enough that a wooden spoon could stand upright in its centre, a feat that would make the cook smile with satisfaction. Some of the fancier versions, eaten by wealthy merchants and minor nobility, could be sliced like a firm custard, but even the humbler versions, made by peasant hands in earthenware pots, were far more nourishing and flavourful than the watery gruel of popular imagination. In a small village somewhere in England, perhaps in Northamptonshire, where archaeologists would centuries later scrape the residues from cooking pots to learn what peasants truly ate, a woman rises before dawn. The fire never truly dies in a medieval home. It is banked at night, a few coals buried in ash to keep their heat until morning. She uncovers these embers now, feeds them kindling, watches flame lick up the sides of her clay pot. This pot is precious. It cost perhaps a day's wages, maybe more. Its exterior is blackened from years of use, its interior worn smooth by countless stirrings. But the porous clay still holds memories. The fats and oils of 1,000 meals have seeped into its very fabric. Into the pot goes water drawn cold from the well before the sun rose. Then barley, the hulled grains she brayed in a wooden mortar 2 days ago, not ground to flour but crushed just enough to let them swell and soften in the cooking. Barley is humble, yes. It grows in wet soil and cold climates where wheat would sulk and fail. But it is hardy, reliable, and when it cooks slowly in water, it releases a subtle sweetness, a creamy texture that fills the belly and warms from within. Some households use oats instead, or dried peas that must soak overnight in a wooden bowl until they surrender their toughness and plump back to life. As the water begins to heat, she adds what the season and her garden provide. In winter, this might be turnips she stored in a pit lined with straw, their earthy sweetness concentrated by months of cold storage. In summer, fresh cabbage, its leaves deep green and strong flavoured, capable of standing up to hours of cooking. Today it is early spring, that difficult time when last year's stores run low and this year's crops are barely sprouting. So she has onions, leeks, and those soaked peas. Each vegetable goes in with purpose. The leeks will sweeten as they cook, their sharpness mellowing to something almost buttery. The onions will deepen the flavour, adding layers of savoury complexity. The peas will thicken the whole thing, releasing their starch until the liquid becomes something more than water, something that clings to bread and satisfies. If there is meat, and today perhaps there is, it goes in now, not a grand cut, not the haunch of beef or loin of pork that graces the Lord's table up at the manor house, but bones, rich with marrow, scraps from butchering, or, if fortune smiles, a piece of mutton from a sheep grown too old for good wool production. Medieval peasants knew how to make these meagre bits sing. The bones simmer for hours, releasing their gelatin until the broth shines with richness and coats the spoon. The tougher cuts of meat, full of sinew and gristle that would resist a quick cooking, break down slowly until they fall apart at the touch of a wooden implement. Nothing is wasted. Even the fat that rises to the surface is precious, a source of flavor and calories that makes the difference between merely surviving and actually thriving. The woman adds herbs now, and this is where the old stories begin to crumble like stale bread. Medieval peasants did not eat bland food. They could not afford cinnamon from Ceylon or pepper from the distant spice routes, true. These precious imports cost more than most families earned in months, but they had their gardens, small plots outside their doors where sage and parsley, thyme and mint, rosemary and dill grew with enthusiastic abundance. She tears sage leaves between her fingers, releasing their perfume into the rising steam. The smell is sharp, almost medicinal, but it will mellow in the cooking. She adds parsley, not just a sprinkle but handfuls of it, for parsley is not merely decoration but food itself. Green and vital, full of the nutrients that keep scurvy and other ailments at bay during the long winter months when fresh greens disappear from the world. The pot simmers. She tends it occasionally, pushing down any vegetables that try to float above the surface, adding water if it cooks down too much. The fire must be watched too, kept steady but not too hot, the coals raked into position beneath the pot's round bottom. This is not a meal that can be rushed. Pottage made in haste is thin and unsatisfying, the grains still hard at their centres, the vegetables raw and bitter. But pottage made with time, with attention, with the accumulated wisdom of mothers and grandmothers stretching back further than anyone can remember. That is, a meal that sustains not just the body, but something deeper. By midday, when the family returns from the fields for their main meal, the pottage has transformed. The barley has swollen to 3 times its original size, each grain tender and distinct yet somehow blended into the whole. The vegetables have given up their individual identities and become part of something greater, a harmony of flavors where you taste earth and garden, fire and time. If there was meat, it has surrendered completely, shredding into tender strands that distribute themselves throughout the pot. The herbs have infused everything, their flavors no longer sharp but woven into the very fabric of the meal. This is what scientists would discover centuries later when they analysed the residues clinging to pottery shards from the medieval village of West Cotton. Using techniques that could identify the fats and proteins absorbed into ancient ceramics, researchers from the University of Bristol found unmistakable evidence these peasant cooking pots had held stews of beef and mutton mixed with vegetables like cabbage and leek. They found dairy products, likely the fresh cheeses known to be part of the peasant diet. The chemical signatures told a story that contradicted centuries of assumption. Medieval peasants ate meat regularly enough that it left its mark on their everyday cookware. The family eats from wooden bowls, using bread as both plate and utensil. Sometimes they might have spoons carved from horn or wood, but often they simply tear pieces of bread to sop up the pottage, letting the thick liquid soak into the grain until each bite is saturated with flavour. The bread itself is dark and dense, made from barley or rye or a mixture of grains called maslin, wheat and rye grown together in the same field and ground together into flour. It is nothing like the soft white bread that the Lord and his family eat, but it has its own virtues. Whole grain full of fibre, rich with the minerals that remain when grain is ground with its bran intact. The kind of bread that modern artisan bakeries would charge handsomely for, though medieval peasants would have traded it in an instant for the refined white loaves of the wealthy. But here is what the peasants did not know, could not know. Their dark bread was keeping them healthier than their betters. While the nobility suffered from the effects of too much refined flour and too much meat, peasants were getting fibre, vitamins and a more balanced diet. Their bread required more chewing, which was better for their teeth and their digestion. The bran that wealthy people paid to have sifted out was protecting peasant bodies from ailments that would not even have names for centuries to come. The pot will stay over the fire. Tomorrow before dawn, the woman will add more water, more vegetables, perhaps some oats this time instead of barley. The pottage will continue, evolving, never quite the same from one day to the next, but always there, always ready. In some households, the pot simmers for days at a time, with ingredients added as they become available. This is not laziness or poverty speaking, but wisdom. A pot that never cools is a pot that never needs to be brought back to a boil, saving precious firewood. A pot that simmers continuously develops flavors that no single-day cooking can achieve, the ingredients melding and maturing like a friendship that deepens over years. And so the day ends as it began, with steam rising from the pot, with the smell of herbs and cooking grain filling the small space, with the knowledge that tomorrow there will be food again. Not fancy food, not the elaborate dishes served at noble tables with their peacocks dressed in their own feathers and their jellies coloured with expensive saffron, but food that nourishes, food that satisfies, food that tells the truth about how people lived, not in misery and deprivation as we have been taught to imagine, but in a kind of practical abundance that we are only now beginning to understand. In the morning there will be bread to bake, but that is another story, and one that deserves its own telling. For now the pot simmers on, as it has simmered for centuries, as it would simmer for centuries more, carrying within it not just food but memory, tradition, and the quiet dignity of people who knew how to transform simple things into sustenance. The secrets of how medieval peasants truly ate are written not in grand recipe books or elaborate chronicles, but in clay pots and garden plots, in the residues that cling to ancient ceramics and the techniques passed down through generations of women who never learned to write but knew, absolutely knew how to feed their families well. The morning begins with grain, as mornings have begun for thousands of years. But before there can be pottage, before there can be porridge, before there can be the staff of life itself, there must be bread. And bread in the medieval world is never simple. It carries within it the weight of social hierarchy, the rhythm of seasons, the very structure of how people understand their place in the world. A peasant woman wakes in darkness, her hands already knowing the motions before her mind fully surfaces from sleep. The grain sits in a wooden chest, precious and carefully rationed. If the harvest was good, there might be enough to last until the next one. If it was poor, well, there are ways to stretch what you have. There are always ways, though some are more pleasant than others. She scoops grain into a wooden bowl, barley most likely, or rye if she lives in the colder, wetter parts of England where these hardier grains thrive. Oats perhaps if she is in the north or the west where the soil is thin and the weather harsh. Wheat would be wonderful, but wheat is for the wealthy. Wheat demands the best land, the most careful cultivation, the kind of resources that peasants rarely command. The Lord grows wheat on his best fields, and his family eats white bread so fine and soft it might as well be cake. But the peasants grow what will actually produce in their strips of land, scattered throughout the village fields, and they eat what grows. The grain must be ground, and here the first complication arises. In her cottage, there might be a small hand quern, 2 round stones that she can turn herself to crush the grain into flour. But the Lord has forbidden this. The mill is his, a massive structure with great grinding stones turned by water or wind, and every household must bring their grain there to be ground. There is a fee, of course. There is always a fee. A portion of the flour, or a few coins if she has them, goes to the miller for his work. Some peasants try to use their hand querns in secret, grinding just enough for a day or two, hiding the evidence. But if they are caught, the fines are steep, and so most people trudge to the mill with their sacks of grain and wait their turn. The miller is not always honest. There are stories, always stories, of millers who keep back more than their share, whose thumbs press heavy on the scales. But there are also millers who are fair, who take pride in their work, who understand that their neighbours depend on them for the very foundation of life. The great stones turn, grain pours into the hopper, and flour, coarse, flecked with bits of bran and germ, nothing like the snow-white powder the wealthy demand, accumulates in sacks and bowls. Back home, the woman mixes her flour with water and the yeast that comes from brewing. Most households make their own ale, a weak, nourishing drink safer than water from questionable sources, and the foam that rises to the top of the fermenting liquid is perfect for making bread rise. She might borrow some from a neighbour whose ale is brewing today, or use a bit of dough saved from the last baking, kept in a cool place and fed with flour and water until it bubbles with life. This is the alchemy of bread, the transformation that humans discovered so long ago that the memory of its discovery is lost to time. The dough comes together under her hands, shaggy at first, then cohesive, though it will never be as smooth as wheat dough. Barley and rye and oats lack the gluten that makes wheat dough elastic and easy to work. They produce breads that are denser, darker, sometimes almost black. The texture is coarse, the crumb tight and heavy. This bread will not rise into airy lightness, it will be substantial, filling, the kind of bread that sticks to your ribs and sustains you through hours of hard labour. But here is another complication. She cannot bake it at home. Most peasant cottages have no oven. The fire on the hearth is for cooking pottage, for warmth, for light. but not for baking bread. Oh, she could try to bake it in the ashes, wrapping the dough in leaves and burying it in the hot coals, and sometimes people do this when there is no other choice. But proper bread, the kind that feeds a family for days, needs a proper oven. The Lord has an oven, of course, or rather, the village has an oven that belongs to the Lord. A large structure built of clay and stone, heated with wood fires until it glows with stored heat. The villagers must bring their dough here to be baked. Another fee, another portion given up. Some places have communal ovens, shared among families, the costs split in ways that shift and change with the seasons and the fortunes of individual households. The woman brings her loaves of dough shaped into rounds or oblongs, scored across the top so they will not burst as they bake. The baker who tends the oven knows his craft. He must judge the heat by holding his hand inside, counting the seconds until he must pull it back. Too hot, and the outside will char while the inside stays raw. Too cool, and the bread will be pale and heavy, never developing the crust that protects it and gives it flavour. He slides the loaves in with a long wooden paddle called a peel, its surface dusted with flour so the dough will not stick. Then he closes the oven mouth and waits. Inside the oven, transformation occurs. The heat wakes the yeast, which releases gas in a final burst of activity before it dies. The dough expands, though not dramatically. These coarse flours cannot trap air the way wheat can. The sugars in the flour caramelize. The crust forms, turning from pale to golden to deep brown, developing flavors that are rich and complex, nutty and slightly sweet despite the absence of any added sweetener. When the loaves emerge, they are dark and dense, their crusts hard enough to require real work from the teeth. They smell of grain and fire, of earth and transformation. A peasant family might bake once a week or once every few days, producing enough bread to last. The loaves keep reasonably well, growing staler with each passing day, but never quite inedible. Stale bread can be dipped in pottage to soften it, or broken into pieces and added to the pot itself, thickening the stew and adding substance. This bread, this dark, heavy, whole-grain bread that peasants eat by necessity, is by modern nutritional standards remarkably healthy. It provides complex carbohydrates that release their energy slowly, keeping blood sugar stable through long hours of physical work. The fiber aids digestion and provides a sense of fullness that refined grains cannot match. The vitamins and minerals that reside in the bran and germ, the parts that wealthy people pay to have removed, protect against deficiencies that plagued those who could afford nothing but refined white flour. Medieval physicians recommended white bread as the healthiest option, the most easily digested, the most refined, and therefore the most appropriate for refined people. They were wrong, though they could not have known it. The peasants eating their coarse dark bread were getting better nutrition than the nobles eating manchet and wastall. Those prestigious white loaves made from flour sifted multiple times through fine cloth until nothing remained but the purest white endosperm. The irony would have been lost on everyone involved. The nobleman looked at his white bread and saw civilization, refinement, the triumph of human ingenuity over crude nature. The peasant looked at his dark bread and saw what he could afford, what his land would grow, what his station in life permitted him. Neither understood that the peasant, in this one small way, had the better deal. But bread is more than nutrition. It is symbol and substance, the centre of every meal, the measure by which other foods are judged. When medieval people spoke of their daily bread, they meant it literally. A prosperous peasant in the 14th century might consume 2 to 3 pounds of bread every day. 2 to 3 pounds. The modern mind reels at the quantity, but consider, these were people who burned 4,000 to 5,000 calories daily in physical labour. They needed energy, and bread provided it in concentrated, portable, storable form. Different breads had different names, a hierarchy of grain and refinement that everyone understood. Pandaman was the whitest, finest bread, its flour sifted 2 or 3 times until it was almost powdery in its fineness. Wastall was also white, though not as carefully refined as pandamen. These were for the tables of lords and wealthy merchants. Cocket was cheaper, harder, more like what we would call a cracker. Cheat was wholemeal wheat with the coarsest bran removed, but plenty of texture remaining. Taut contained all the husk and grain together, brown and hearty. Horse bread was made from whatever was available, beans, peas, any grain at all mixed together, and fed to animals and, in desperate times, to people. Peasants ate what they could get. In most of England, this meant maslin bread, made from wheat and rye grown together in the same field and ground together into a flour that combined the best qualities of both. Rye provided reliability and a distinctive sour flavor. Wheat, even in small quantities, added some lightness and helped the dough hold together. The resulting bread was darker than wheat alone, but lighter than pure rye. It was affordable, nutritious, and deeply satisfying in the way that foods eaten for generations become woven into the very definition of comfort. In some regions, barley bread predominated. In others, especially the cold, wet north and west, oat bread was the staple. Oats require special handling because they contain no gluten at all. The oatmeal had to be prepared using a sourdough method, allowing natural yeasts and bacteria to develop and create structure through fermentation rather than gluten. Resulting bread was baked on a heated bakestone or iron plate, producing flat, dense cakes that could be stored for months if kept dry. These oat cakes were humble food, the bread of the poorest regions, but they sustained entire populations through winters that would have defeated less hardy grains. The woman carries her baked bread home, the loaves still warm, their weight satisfying in her arms. At home she will cut thick slices to go with the pottage, or save some for the evening meal of bread and cheese. The bread will be the foundation of every meal, the constant around which everything else revolves. When she packs food for her husband and sons to take to the fields, it will be bread and cheese and ale, portable and sustaining. When unexpected guests arrive and hospitality demands she feed them, bread will be the first thing she offers, the universal gesture of welcome and provision. And all of this, the grain growing in the field, the grinding at the mill, the mixing and rising and baking, is governed by laws and customs that shape how peasants live. The assize of bread and ale, established in England in the 13th century, regulated the price and weight of bread based on the current price of grain. When grain was expensive, loaves could be made smaller. When it was cheap, they had to be larger. This was meant to protect both bakers and consumers, ensuring that everyone could afford the staff of life regardless of the year's harvest. Bakers who cheated, who sold underweight loaves or adulterated their flour with cheaper substances, faced fines and punishment. Some were even placed in the pillory, held up to public shame for violating the trust that bound the community together. For bread was not just food. It was sacred. Every Christian took communion, consuming bread that was the body of Christ. Bread wasted was a sin. Bread shared was a blessing. The prayers people said before eating acknowledged bread as God's gift, the result of divine providence working through human labor. And indeed, bread was a kind of miracle. Take seeds so small you can barely feel them between your fingers. Plant them in dirt, add water and sun and time and human toil, and harvest grain that can be ground and mixed and baked into something that keeps people alive. What is that if not miraculous? The loaves cool on a wooden shelf. Outside, the day grows brighter. There is work to be done in the fields, in the garden, in the endless round of tasks that keep a household functioning. But for now, there is bread. Fresh bread, dark and hearty, waiting to be broken and shared. And that, in its own way, is enough. The garden plot behind the cottage is small, perhaps no larger than a modern bedroom, but it is tended with the kind of attention usually reserved for precious things, because it is precious. While the great fields that stretch beyond the village grow the grain that keeps everyone alive, these little gardens grow the foods that make life worth living. The difference between mere survival and actual nourishment often comes down to what can be coaxed from a few square yards of carefully worked soil. The woman who bakes bread and tends the pottage pot also tends this garden, though the work is often shared among the women and children of the household. They know every plant, every corner where the soil drains well or holds moisture, every spot that catches the sun longest or stays shaded and cool. This knowledge is not written down in books. It passes from mother to daughter, neighbour to neighbour, in demonstrations and corrections and the accumulated wisdom of generations who have worked this same earth. Near the cottage door, herbs grow in profusion. Sage, with its soft grey-green leaves that seem to hold the light. Parsley, both the curly-leafed and flat-leafed varieties, growing so abundantly that handfuls can be cut without worrying about taking too much. Thyme creeps along the ground, its tiny leaves releasing their sharp perfume when brushed. Mint spreads with such enthusiasm that it must be contained, though its aggressive growth is welcome. There is always mint for tea, for flavouring, for adding to pottage, or mixing with peas. Rosemary grows tall and woody, its needle-like leaves staying green even through winter. Dill sends up feathery fronds that sway in the breeze. Fennel grows wherever it can find a foothold, its anise-like flavour used in everything from fish dishes to bread. These are not luxuries, they are necessities, though of a different kind than grain and water. A pot of cabbage and peas might keep you alive, but a pot of cabbage and peas with sage and parsley and a hint of rosemary, that is food that makes you glad to be alive. Medieval peasants understood this distinction deeply. They could not afford pepper from India or cinnamon from distant islands whose names they would never hear, but they could grow herbs, and they did, with dedication and skill. The herbs serve double duty. What flavors food also heals illness, or so people believe, and they are not entirely wrong. Sage is good for digestion and was thought to cleanse the body of venom and pestilence. Its Latin name salvia means to save, and medieval people took this seriously, using it for everything from colds to coughs to general malaise. Parsley, beyond its pleasant flavour, provides vitamins that keep scurvy at bay. Mint soothes upset stomachs and aids digestion, important when your diet consists largely of dried peas and coarse bread. Rosemary placed under the pillow was said to ward off nightmares. Whether this worked through some genuine property of the plant or simply through the comfort of its familiar scent, people found it valuable enough to cultivate carefully. Beyond the herbs, vegetables grow in neat rows or organized chaos, depending on the gardener's preference and the shape of the available space. Onions, those fundamental building blocks of flavor, push their green tops up through the soil. They will be pulled young and eaten fresh, or left to mature and stored through winter, their papery skins protecting the pungent bulbs beneath. Leeks grow tall and straight, their white bases buried in trenched earth to keep them tender and pale. Where onions are sharp and aggressive, leeks are mellow and sweet, especially after long cooking. They are perfect for pottage, breaking down into silky strands that seem to disappear into the broth while leaving their essence behind. Cabbage grows in tight, heavy heads that can weigh as much as a newborn lamb. This is a vegetable that thrives on neglect, that grows in poor soil and cold weather, that can be harvested from autumn through winter and into spring if the frost does not hit too hard. Cabbage is dependable. Cabbage is filling. Cabbage, when cooked long and slow, develops a sweetness that surprises those who have only eaten it raw or boiled quickly into submission. The outer leaves, too tough for eating, go to feed pigs or get dug into the soil to enrich it for next year's planting. Nothing is wasted. Turnips and parsnips grow underground, their leafy tops marking where the treasures hide. Turnips are sharp and peppery when raw, but cooking mellows them into something almost buttery. Parsnips are sweet, especially after the first frost has touched them, converting their starches to sugars. Both can be stored through winter in pits lined with straw, buried just deep enough to protect them from the hardest freezes, but shallow enough that they can be dug up when needed. A pot of pottage in February, when fresh food is a distant memory, becomes something special when a parsnip is added, its sweetness a reminder that winter does not last forever. Peas grow on vines that must be supported with sticks cut from the hedgerows. They are eaten fresh in summer, sweet and crisp straight from the pod, a treat for children who help with the gardening. But most are left to mature and dry, the pods turning brown and papery, the peas inside hardening into dense little spheres that will keep for years if stored properly. These dried peas are fundamental to survival. They provide protein when meat is scarce or forbidden by the church's fasting rules. They thicken pottage, turning watery broth into something substantial. They can be ground into flour and mixed with grain to make bread when the harvest has been poor and stores are running low. Beans grow alongside the peas, fat pods that swell with promising bumps. Fava beans, also called broad beans, are the main variety, large and meaty and filling. Like peas, they can be eaten fresh or dried. Unlike peas, they have a richness that approaches the satisfaction of meat. The peasantry eats more beans than the nobility, who view them with some suspicion. There are concerns about flatulence, certainly, but also a sense that beans are coarse food, peasant food, beneath the dignity of refined palates. The peasants do not mind this snobbery. More beans for them, more protein, more substance. Garlic grows in its own corner, the cloves planted in autumn and left to develop through winter into full heads by summer. The smell is strong, the flavour stronger, but this is considered a virtue. Garlic keeps illness away, or so people believe, and they eat it liberally in pottages and stews. The wealthy wrinkle their noses at the smell of garlic on a peasant's breath, but the peasants have noticed that they seem to get sick less often than their betters, and they attribute this, at least in part, to their generous consumption of the stinking rose. Carrots grow, though these are not the bright orange cylinders of modern imagination. Medieval carrots come in purple, yellow, white, even a reddish variety that is considered particularly choice. They are smaller than modern carrots, more fibrous but sweet nonetheless, especially when roasted in the ashes of the fire or boiled until tender in pottage. The greens are edible too, though bitter, and sometimes added to stews for their colour and vitamins. This garden, so small and humble, produces an astonishing variety of foods. In spring there are fresh greens, tender lettuce, young onions, the first cutting of herbs. In summer, peas and beans, carrots and turnips, cabbage and leeks, all at their peak. In autumn, the last of the vegetables are harvested and stored. The ground is prepared for winter, and perhaps a few hardy greens are planted to provide something fresh when the world seems entirely brown and dead. In winter the garden rests, but its bounty continues in the form of stored roots and dried peas and beans, herbs hanging from the rafters, onions and garlic strung up in the cottage's dark corners. Recent archaeological work has revealed just how important these gardens were. When scientists analysed residues from peasant cooking pots, they found not just the expected grains and occasional meat, but clear evidence of vegetables. Cabbage and leeks appeared again and again, their chemical signatures preserved in the porous clay. These were not occasional luxuries, but regular parts of the diet, eaten often enough to leave their mark on the very vessels used to cook them. The gardens provided something else too, a measure of control in lives that were otherwise subject to forces beyond anyone's influence. A peasant could not control the weather that determined whether the grain harvest would be good or catastrophic. She could not control the lord who demanded labour and fees and portions of everything produced. She could not control the church that dictated when meat could be eaten and when only fish and vegetables were permitted. But she could control her garden. She could decide where to plant the garlic and how much space to give the peas. She could experiment with growing something new, a cutting begged from a neighbour's thriving mint plant or seeds saved from a particularly good parsnip. The garden was hers in a way that almost nothing else in her life was hers, and the garden connected her to something larger than herself. The herbs she grew were the same herbs her mother grew and her grandmother, and women stretching back through generations. The techniques she used, the companion planting that put beans near cabbages because they seemed to help each other grow, the practice of leaving some plants to go to seed so there would be seeds for next year, the knowledge of which herbs could be cut heavily without harm and which needed gentler harvesting, all of this was inherited knowledge, tested and refined over centuries. Some of what grew in peasant gardens would surprise modern observers. There were flowers, yes, but not purely ornamental ones. Marigolds grew for their bright petals that could be added to stews for colour and a subtle bitter flavour. Violets grew for their leaves and flowers, both edible, both used in cooking and medicine. Primroses provided early spring greens when nothing else was available. The line between food and medicine and decoration was not firmly drawn. A plant might be beautiful and useful and healing all at once, and peasants, who could not afford to waste space on purely decorative plants, chose accordingly. The care of these gardens was often women's work, though not exclusively. Children helped with weeding and watering, learning as they worked which plants were precious and which were weeds to be pulled. Men might help with the heavier work of turning soil or building supports for climbing beans, but day to day it was women who knew the gardens intimately, who noticed when a plant looked stressed or when pests were beginning to damage the leaves, who made the constant small decisions that determined whether the garden would thrive or merely survive. These women could not read or write. Their names appear in no records, except perhaps as wife of in manor rolls, documenting fees owed or services rendered, but they were experts in their own right, possessing knowledge that kept their families fed and healthy. They could identify dozens of plants by sight and smell and touch. They knew which leaves to pick for flavouring pottage and which to dry for winter tea. They understood the rhythms of the seasons, when to plant and when to harvest, how to save seeds and how to prepare the soil. This expertise was not considered remarkable because it was common, but that does not make it any less real or valuable. And so the garden grows, season after season, year after year. Sometimes the harvest is abundant, and there are vegetables to share with neighbours or sell at market. Sometimes pests or disease or bad weather reduce the yield, and the family makes do with less. But always, there is something growing, some connection to the earth and its cycles, some source of flavour and nutrition beyond the endless round of grain and bread. How the modern world has come to romanticize these medieval gardens, imagining them as peaceful havens of organic abundance. The reality was harder, more precarious, more dependent on luck and weather and constant labour. But it is also true that these gardens provided something that many modern people lack, a direct connection between effort and nourishment, between care and reward, between seed and table. The woman who planted the herbs and vegetables also cooked them and ate them, and felt them sustain her body through another day of work. There was an intimacy in that, a kind of knowledge that no book can truly convey. The sun climbs higher, there is weeding to be done, watering if the weather has been dry, harvesting of whatever is ready. The garden demands attention, but it also gives generously to those who tend it with care and knowledge. And tonight, when the pottage simmers and fresh herbs are added, when leeks and cabbage from the garden mingle with barley and perhaps a scrap of meat, the result will be more than the sum of its parts. It will be a meal that nourishes and satisfies, that carries within it the work of hands and the wisdom of generations. It will be, in its own humble way, a small miracle repeated daily, mostly by women whose names we will never know, but whose skill kept entire communities alive and thriving. The question of meat hangs over every discussion of medieval peasant diet like smoke over a cooking fire, present, unavoidable, and more complex than it first appears. The old stories tell us that peasants rarely, if ever, tasted meat, that it was a luxury reserved for the wealthy, that the common folk subsisted on bread and thin gruel, while their lords feasted on roasted boar and venison. But like so many old stories, this one crumbles when examined closely. The truth is more interesting, more nuanced, and reveals a resourcefulness that deserves recognition rather than the pity we have too often offered to our ancestors. A pig roots in the narrow space behind a peasant cottage, confined by a rough fence of woven branches. This pig is not impressive by modern standards. It is smaller, leaner, its body designed for foraging rather than the rapid weight gain prized by industrial agriculture. But this pig is precious. It represents a kind of wealth that can walk on four legs, converting kitchen scraps and acorns from the woods into meat and fat that will help the family survive the winter. Most peasant families kept a pig, sometimes two. Pigs were ideal for people with limited resources and space. Unlike cattle, which require extensive grazing land and careful management, pigs can thrive on almost anything. They eat vegetable scraps, whey left over from cheese making, windfall apples, roots dug from the woods. During autumn, they are turned loose in the forest to feast on acorns and beech nuts, fattening themselves on mast that humans cannot easily digest. A pig kept this way costs little to maintain and provides much in return. Come late autumn, usually around Martinmas in November, the pig is killed. This is not a quick or casual undertaking. The entire family participates, and often neighbours as well, for there is more work than two hands can manage, and the meat must be processed quickly before it spoils. Every part of the pig is used because nothing, absolutely nothing, can be wasted. The meat is cut into portions that will be salted or smoked or both. The blood is caught in bowls and mixed with grain and fat to make black pudding, a sausage that will keep for weeks. The intestines are cleaned and used as casings for other sausages. The meat minced and mixed with herbs and spices if the family can afford them. The head is boiled into brawn, a jellied meat dish that makes even the cheeks and ears and snout edible and palatable. The trotters are pickled. The fat is rendered into lard, precious for cooking and even, in desperate times, for providing light when mixed with a wick. The preserved pork will last for months. A few slices of bacon, smoky and salty and intensely flavoured, can transform a pot of cabbage and beans from merely filling to genuinely satisfying. A piece of salt pork simmered in pottage releases its fat and flavour slowly, enriching everything it touches. The peasant family that slaughtered a pig in November can still be eating from it in March or April, the preserved meat bridging the hungry gap between winter stores and spring abundance. But pork is not the only meat peasants eat, despite what simplified histories suggest. Chickens scratch in the dirt outside almost every cottage, pecking at seeds and insects, laying eggs with admirable regularity. These chickens are not the plump, meaty birds of modern farms. They are smaller, rangier, their meat tougher and more flavourful. A chicken might end up in the pot if it stops laying eggs, or if there is a special occasion worth celebrating. More often, chickens are valued for those eggs, a steady source of protein that does not require killing the animal that produces it. Eggs appear in the diet regularly, fried in the precious lard from the autumn pig slaughter, or added to pottage to enrich it, or mixed with flour and herbs to make simple pancakes or fritters. During the many fasting days when meat is forbidden by church law, eggs occupy an uncertain position, sometimes allowed, sometimes not, depending on the strictness of the particular fast. but when they are permitted, they provide protein and richness that vegetables alone cannot match. Mutton comes from sheep too old or weak to continue producing good wool. These animals, kept primarily for their fleeces and only secondarily for their meat, can live for years before ending up in the pot. By then, the meat is tough and requires long, slow cooking to become tender. But peasants are expert at long, slow cooking. A sheep might be slaughtered at a time when the meat can be shared among several families, everyone contributing to the butchering and receiving portions in return. The meat goes into pottage naturally, simmered for hours with roots and grains until even the toughest cuts surrender their flavour and become edible. Beef is rarer, but not unknown. Cattle are valuable for their milk and their labour, pulling ploughs and carts, and are usually kept alive as long as they remain useful. But eventually, an ox grows too old for work, or a cow stops producing milk, and then the decision must be made. The meat from these elderly animals is tough beyond belief, stringy and requiring marathon cooking sessions to become edible. But it is still meat, still protein, still fat, in a world where fat is always in short supply. So it is eaten, probably in communal feasts, where many families share the burden and the bounty, or preserved with salt for later use. Here is where the archaeological evidence becomes fascinating and forces us to reconsider old assumptions. When researchers analysed the cooking pots from West Cotton, that small medieval village in Northamptonshire, they found clear chemical evidence of both beef and mutton. These were not occasional traces suggesting rare treats, but regular signatures indicating that meat was cooked in these vessels often enough to leave lasting marks in the clay. Peasants were eating meat and eating it regularly enough that it shows up unmistakably in the archaeological record. But meat is not always meat that modern people would recognise as such. The medieval definition is broader, more inclusive, encompassing parts of animals that we now discard or feed to pets. Offal, the organs and odd bits left after the choice cuts are taken, is peasant food par excellence. The lord and his family eat the loins and haunches. The peasants get the liver, the kidneys, the heart, the tongue, the feet, the head. And peasant cooks, through necessity and ingenuity, have learned to make these parts not just edible but delicious. Liver is rich and iron-heavy, fried quickly or added to pottage. Kidneys are strong-flavoured but nutritious. Hearts are muscle, dense and meaty when sliced thin and cooked properly. Tongues are tender after long boiling, their unique texture becoming something prized rather than rejected. Feet, full of bones and connective tissue, simmer into gelatinous broths that set up firm when cooled, providing both nutrition and a way to preserve meat in the days before refrigeration. Even the blood is food, mixed with grain and fat and herbs to make puddings that are filling and protein-rich. Then there are the small game animals that populate the woods and fields. The Lord claims the deer and the wild boar, forbidding peasants from hunting these prestigious animals under penalty of harsh punishment. But rabbits, birds, the laws are less clear, more variable by region and time period. Some peasants trap rabbits in snares or hunt them with dogs. Small birds, larks, thrushes, even sparrows can be caught in nets or with limes spread on branches where they like to perch. These provide tiny portions of meat, barely a mouthful, but in a world where every bit of protein matters, they are worth the effort of catching. Fish, however, is where the story of peasant protein becomes truly interesting. The Church forbids meat on Fridays in commemoration of Christ's crucifixion. It forbids meat on Wednesdays and sometimes Saturdays as well. It forbids meat during the 40 days of Lent leading up to Easter, during the weeks of Advent before Christmas, on the vigils before major feast days. Add it all up, and a medieval Christian might be expected to avoid meat for a third of the year, perhaps even more depending on how strictly the rules are interpreted and enforced. But fish is not meat. Fish is cold-blooded, lives in water, belongs to a different category entirely in the medieval understanding of the natural world. So on all those meatless days, fish becomes the substitute protein, the allowed alternative that makes fasting possible without actual starvation. For coastal communities and those living near rivers, this is manageable. Fresh fish can be caught and eaten the same day, providing variety and nutrition. But for inland communities miles from the nearest coastline, fresh fish is a luxury that rarely appears. Instead, there is preserved fish, salted cod, split down the middle and dried until it becomes hard as wood, called stockfish because it had to be beaten with a stick before soaking in water to rehydrate it. Salted herring, packed in barrels with coarse salt, the fish transformed into something that can last for months without spoiling. These preserved fish are cheap, relatively speaking. Cheap enough that even peasants can afford them when the church demands fish instead of meat. The taste is strong, salty, and insistently fishy. A 15th century schoolboy complained bitterly in his notebook about eating nothing but salt fish during Lent, claiming it generated so much phlegm in his body that he could scarcely speak or breathe. Monks and wealthy townspeople might have access to fresh fish, to river trout or pond carp, to elaborate fish dishes flavoured with expensive spices. But peasants eat stockfish and salt herring, and they eat it often. Yet here is a curious reversal that our ancestors could not have known. Salmon, that fish we now consider a luxury, a marker of upscale restaurants and special occasions, was peasant food in medieval times. Rivers teemed with salmon during spawning season, so many fish crowding the waters that they could be caught almost effortlessly. Apprentices and servants in some regions had clauses in their contracts, limiting how often they could be fed salmon, lest they revolt against the monotony. What we now pay premium prices for was once so common that people tired of eating it. The salmon provides omega-3 fatty acids, essential nutrients that the human body cannot produce on its own and must obtain from food. Plant sources provide some, but the human body cannot efficiently convert plant omega-3s into the forms it needs. Fish, especially fatty fish like salmon, provide these nutrients in forms that the body can use immediately. Without knowing any of this biochemistry, without having any concept of omega-3 fatty acids or inflammation or cardiovascular health, medieval peasants eating salmon were nourishing their bodies in ways that their meat-heavy betters were not. So how much meat did peasants actually eat? The records suggest more than the old stories would have us believe. A prosperous English peasant in the 14th century might consume 8 ounces of meat, fish, or other protein per day. This is not an enormous amount by modern standards, but neither is it the near-total absence of meat that folklore insists upon. Combined with the protein from dairy products, eggs, and legumes, peasants were getting adequate protein for their needs, perhaps even good protein intake given the physical demands of their labour. The caloric needs were substantial. A man doing heavy agricultural labour all day might burn 4,000 to 5,000 calories. Medieval peasants were not eating that much every day. Estimates suggest 3,500 to 4,500 calories for working adults, but they were eating substantial amounts of food, and some of that food was meat or fish. The pottage that simmered constantly contained meat or fish or both, often enough that the chemical traces persist in pottery shards nearly 1,000 years later. This does not mean that medieval peasants lived in protein-rich abundance. Bad years happened, when the harvest failed, and even bread became scarce, much less meat. Seasonal variations meant that autumn, after the pig slaughter, offered much more meat than spring, when preserved stores were running low. Social position mattered too. A prosperous peasant with several strips of land and resources to spare ate better than a landless labourer working for wages. Regional differences were significant, with some areas having better access to fish or game than others. But the picture that emerges from careful examination of the evidence is not one of unrelieved deprivation. It is a picture of people who understood their resources and used them skillfully, who knew how to preserve food to last through lean times, who wasted nothing and found ways to make even the least promising ingredients into nourishment. The pig slaughtered in November and carefully preserved could feed a family for months. A river full of salmon, however common and taken for granted, provided essential nutrition. A pot of stockfish, soaked and cooked with herbs and vegetables, might not be delicious by modern restaurant standards, but it filled bellies and provided protein when the church said meat was forbidden. The medieval peasant diet was not perfect. Seasonal variations in vitamin availability led to deficiencies, especially in late winter when stored foods had lost much of their nutritional value. Heavy reliance on grains meant that when the grain harvest failed, disaster followed. The near-total absence of food safety regulations meant that spoiled or contaminated food sometimes made people sick, but the presence of meat and fish in the regular diet, combined with dairy, eggs, and legumes, meant that peasants were getting adequate protein to fuel their demanding physical labour, and sometimes, just sometimes, they were getting better nutrition than their betters. The noble who feasted on roasted meats and refined white bread, who could afford exotic spices and elaborate dishes, was also consuming too much saturated fat, too much refined flour stripped of its nutrients, not enough fibre or vegetables. The peasant eating dark bread and pottage enriched with a bit of bacon or salt fish was getting whole grains, vegetables, adequate protein and a more balanced diet overall. Neither knew this, of course. The lord looked at his table and saw abundance and privilege. The peasant looked at his bowl and saw what he could afford. But health is not always a matter of wealth, and sometimes the humble meal nourishes better than the feast. The dairy cow stands in a small byre attached to the cottage, her warmth helping to heat the living space during cold months. She is not a magnificent animal by any measure, smaller than modern cattle, less productive, prone to going dry during the winter when fodder runs short. But she is patient and steady, and every morning she provides something close to miraculous: milk. Not every peasant family has a cow. Cows require grazing land, fodder for winter, attention and care that compete with all the other demands of medieval life. But many families manage it, or share a cow among neighbours, or keep a goat instead, hardier, less demanding, able to subsist on roughage that a cow would reject. The milk these animals provide becomes a cornerstone of the peasant diet, though rarely in the form we might expect. Fresh milk, warmed from the udder, goes primarily to calves and children. Adults seldom drink it plain. There are practical reasons for this. Milk spoils quickly in a world without refrigeration, turning sour within hours on a warm day. But there are also cultural reasons, beliefs about digestion and humoral balance, that mark fresh milk as food for the very young or the sick, not for healthy adults engaged in hard labour. The medieval understanding of nutrition is wrong in its details, but sometimes accidentally right in its conclusions. Fresh milk does spoil easily and can harbour bacteria that make people ill. Better to transform it into something more stable, more keeping, more useful. So the milk is transformed. Some is left to sour naturally, the bacteria already present multiplying until the milk thickens and takes on a pleasant tang. This is not spoilage but controlled fermentation, the same process that makes yogurt, though medieval peasants would not have used that word. Soured milk keeps longer than fresh and is easier to digest for those whose bodies no longer produce the enzymes needed to process lactose. It can be drunk as is, or mixed with bread for a simple meal, or added to pottage to enrich it. Buttermilk is another product, the liquid left behind when cream is churned into butter. It is thin and tangy, full of protein despite its watery appearance. Peasants drink it gladly, wasting nothing. The cream that rises to the top of milk sits in wide, shallow pans until it thickens, then gets poured into a churn, perhaps a tall wooden vessel with a plunger, or sometimes just a jar that can be shaken and rolled until the fat globules clump together into butter. The work is tedious and tiring, usually assigned to children or the elderly, anyone whose labour is less valuable in the fields. Butter, when it finally forms, is scooped out and worked to remove as much buttermilk as possible. Then it faces a choice. Fresh butter is a luxury, sweet and mild, spread on bread or melted over vegetables. But fresh butter spoils quickly, so most of it is salted heavily, packed into crocks or barrels, sealed away for later use. Salted butter keeps for months, its flavour growing stronger and more pronounced, but it remains a source of fat that can make the difference between a meal that merely fills and one that satisfies. But the greatest transformation of milk is into cheese. This is alchemy of the most practical kind, taking a liquid that spoils in hours and converting it into a solid that can last for months or even years. The process requires knowledge, skill, and careful attention, but peasant women have all three in abundance. The milk is warmed, not boiled, brought to a temperature that the hand can barely tolerate. Into it goes rennet, an enzyme from the stomach of a calf or sometimes extracted from certain plants, fig sap or thistle flowers. The rennet causes the milk proteins to coagulate, separating into curds and whey. The curds are thick and lumpy, holding most of the fat and protein. The whey is thin and greenish, but far from worthless. It goes to feed the pigs or sometimes is drunk by the poor, providing nutrients even in this leftover state. The curds are cut and drained, the whey pressed out through cloth until what remains is relatively dry and compact. What happens next depends on what kind of cheese is wanted. Fresh cheese, barely aged, is soft and mild and must be eaten within days. This is the green cheese mentioned in medieval records. Green not in colour, but in newness. Still wet with whey, not fully pressed or aged. It is peasant cheese, simple and unassuming but perfectly adequate spread on bread or crumbled into pottage. Other cheeses are pressed harder, the whey forced out more completely, and then left to age. Wheels or blocks of cheese sit on shelves in the coolest part of the cottage, developing rinds, their flavours deepening and sharpening with time. Some cheeses are washed with brine or ale to keep mould at bay. Some are deliberately encouraged to develop certain molds that add flavor. The cheesemaker learns by doing, by watching what works and what fails, by tasting and adjusting and remembering. The varieties we think of as distinctly medieval, cheddar, brie, parmesan, already exist in recognizable forms. Cheddar comes from the village of that name in Somerset, where the process of cutting and stacking the curds repeatedly produces cheese with a particular texture and flavor. Brie comes from the region east of Paris, soft and rich, though peasants are more likely to make harder cheeses that travel and keep better. Parmesan, that hard granular cheese from Parma, is already being produced in Italy, though few English peasants will ever taste it. Cheese is portable protein, concentrated nutrition that does not spoil. A hunk of cheese and a piece of bread make a complete meal for someone working in the fields all day. Cheese grated or crumbled into pottage adds richness and depth. Cheese melted over bread or vegetables transforms simple foods into something more satisfying. And cheese can be stored through winter when the cow goes dry and no fresh milk flows. But dairy is complicated by the church's calendar in ways that meat is not. During Lent and other strict fasting periods, dairy products join meat on the list of forbidden foods. Milk, butter, cheese, eggs, all are sometimes prohibited, depending on the stringency of the particular fast. This creates challenges for people whose diet depends heavily on these foods, and medieval cooks develop workarounds. Almond milk becomes the substitute of choice, though it is expensive and time-consuming to make. Almonds must be soaked, ground into a paste, then mixed with water and strained. The resulting liquid is white like milk, though thinner and with a distinctive nutty flavor. It can be used in cooking, added to pottages and sauces, even made into a kind of almond milk cheese. But almonds are imported and costly, affordable for the wealthy but beyond the reach of most peasants. So during the strictest fasts, peasant diets become more limited, more dependent on grains and vegetables, less rich and varied. The seasonal rhythm of dairy production shapes how people eat. In spring, when grass grows lush and green, cows produce abundantly. There is milk for drinking and cooking, cream for butter, enough to make cheese that will carry the family through leaner times. In summer, production continues, though the milk may taste of whatever plants the cows are grazing, wild onions sometimes, making the milk faintly pungent. In autumn, as grass growth slows, milk production decreases, and in winter, many cows go dry entirely, their bodies conserving resources until spring when they will calve, and the cycle begins anew. This means that winter diets lack the dairy richness of summer, another reason why preserved foods become so important. The cheese made in spring and summer must last through winter when no fresh cheese can be produced. Butter salted in August must remain edible in January. Eggs from chickens slow down in winter too, though they never stop entirely the way milk does. The rhythms of animal biology shape human nutrition in ways that are absolutely fundamental but invisible to anyone who has only known the constant availability of modern supermarkets. Archaeological evidence suggests that dairy was indeed a regular part of the peasant diet. Those same cooking pots from West Cotton that showed traces of meat also showed traces of dairy fat, not just occasionally but consistently enough to indicate regular use. Peasants were eating cheese, cooking with milk or butter, incorporating dairy into their daily meals in ways that provided protein and calcium and fats their bodies needed. And here, as with bread, there is an unexpected reversal. The wealthy prefer butter to cheese in many contexts, valuing its delicacy and its relative rarity. But cheese, especially aged cheese, concentrates nutrients in ways that butter does not. The protein that would be diluted across pints of milk is compressed into ounces of cheese. The calcium that strengthens bones is preserved and concentrated. Cheese is more nutritious per bite than butter, though neither wealthy nor poor knew this in biochemical terms. Fresh milk, when adults did drink it, came usually from goats rather than cows. Goat milk is easier for many people to digest, less likely to cause the bloating and discomfort that cow milk sometimes produces. Goats themselves are easier to keep, requiring less space and fodder, able to thrive on plants too coarse or bitter for cows. A family without resources for a cow might still manage a goat or two, and the milk these animals provide, though less abundant than a cow's, is just as valuable. Whey, that thin greenish liquid left behind when cheese is made, deserves special mention. Modern people mostly discard it, seeing it as waste. Medieval peasants knew better. Whey contains protein, vitamins, minerals, not as concentrated as in the curds, but present nonetheless. They feed it to pigs, which is practical. but they also drink it themselves sometimes, or cook with it, or use it to soak grains before cooking. Nothing is wasted because nothing can be wasted. And even this byproduct of cheese making has value. The milk, butter and cheese that peasants produce is rarely for their own consumption alone. Some is owed to the Lord as rent or dues. Some is sold at market to earn coins for paying taxes or buying necessities that cannot be produced at home. A particularly good cheesemaker might develop a reputation, her products sought after and commanding better prices. This is a source of pride and a tiny measure of economic independence in a world where both are rare for women. But enough remains for the family's own use that dairy becomes a fundamental part of nutrition. A bowl of pottage enriched with milk or a bit of butter tastes richer, more satisfying than one made only with water. A piece of cheese and some bread make a meal that sustains through hours of field work. A cup of buttermilk on a hot day refreshes and nourishes simultaneously. The calcium from dairy helps build strong bones, important for people engaged in heavy physical labor from childhood onward. The protein supplements what comes from grains and occasional meat. The fat provides concentrated calories in a world where hunger is always a possibility. And the vitamins, B vitamins especially, also present in dairy, support health in ways that medieval people could observe even if they could not explain. Children particularly benefit from dairy. They are the ones most likely to drink fresh milk, their growing bodies needing the nutrients it provides. They eat cheese readily, perhaps more readily than they eat some vegetables. The calcium and protein support their growth into adults capable of the demanding labor that medieval life requires. So the cow stands in her byre, patient and steady, producing the milk that becomes butter and cheese and buttermilk and whey. She is not a pet, not exactly, but neither is she just livestock. She is part of the household economy, a living investment that returns dividends daily in the form of nutrition that keeps the family healthy and fed. Her care is work milking twice daily, mucking out the byre, finding fodder, tending her when she is ill. But the work pays returns that make it worthwhile, transforming grass and water and attention into food that sustains human life. The sun sets, the cow has been milked, the milk set aside to separate into cream and skim. Tomorrow some will be churned into butter, some will be made into cheese, some will go into the pottage pot, enriching the evening meal. And through all these transformations, the simple gift of milk becomes the varied and vital contributions of dairy to a diet that, while not luxurious, is far more adequate and nourishing than the impoverished gruel of legend would suggest. The peasants who tend these animals and transform their milk do not think of themselves as fortunate. They know the labor and uncertainty of their lives too intimately for that, but they are getting nutrition that sustains them, that fuels their work, that keeps them alive and functioning through the endless demands of medieval life. And that, in its own way, is a kind of abundance worth acknowledging. The church bells ring calling the faithful to prayer, but they also mark something else. The rhythm of eating and abstaining that shapes every medieval life. To understand how peasants ate, you must understand the calendar that governs their tables, the weekly and yearly cycles of feast and fast that turn food into something more than mere nutrition. Religion and sustenance are woven together so tightly that separating them becomes impossible. Friday is a fish day, every Friday, in commemoration of Christ's suffering on the cross. Wednesday too, in many places, remembering Judas's betrayal. Saturday sometimes, honouring the Virgin Mary. Already, before considering the major fasting seasons, a medieval Christian avoids meat at least 1 day per week, often 2 or 3. This is not optional. This is religious law, enforced by social pressure and sometimes by actual penalties. Then comes Lent, those 40 days before Easter when the restrictions tighten like a noose. No meat certainly, but also no eggs, no dairy, no butter or cheese or milk. The diet becomes austere, limited to grains and vegetables and fish, and even the fish must be eaten without rich sauces or elaborate preparation. This is meant to be sacrifice, a bodily experience of limitation that prepares the soul for Easter's celebration. Advent brings similar restrictions in the weeks before Christmas, though usually less severe than Lent. The Ember Days, 4 sets of 3 days marking the changing seasons, require fasting. The vigils before major feast days mean abstinence. Add it all up, truly count the days, and a medieval person might spend 150 days per year, perhaps more, under some kind of dietary restriction. That is nearly half the year when what you eat is determined not by preference or availability, but by religious obligation. For wealthy people, this is inconvenient but manageable. They have access to expensive fish, to elaborate meat substitutes made from almonds and spices, to dispensations that can be purchased when the rules feel too burdensome. They can eat lamprey and sturgeon, prestigious fish that cost as much as meat and taste, to the refined palate, almost as satisfying. They have cooks skilled in creating dishes that observe the letter of the law while violating its spirit, meals that avoid meat but achieve richness through layered flavors and costly ingredients. Peasants have no such luxuries. For them, fish days mean saltfish, that stockfish beaten with mallets until it is soft enough to soak, or those barrels of herring packed in brine so heavily that the fish must be soaked repeatedly to become edible. The taste is strong, assertively fishy, salty enough to make you reach for water or weak ale. It is nothing like fresh trout or grilled salmon or any of the fish dishes that grace noble tables. Yet there is an unexpected grace in this. The rules that restrict the wealthy to fish also restrict peasants, creating a kind of equality unknown in almost every other aspect of medieval life. On Fridays and during Lent, lord and peasant alike are forbidden meat. They may eat different kinds of fish, prepared in vastly different ways, but they are both eating fish. The religious calendar levels social distinctions in ways that the economic order never does. And for peasants, the restrictions may actually improve nutrition. On meat days, peasants eat pottage with perhaps a bit of bacon or salt pork, or sometimes no meat at all if supplies are low. On fish days, they eat pottage with stockfish or herring, which provides protein and those omega-3 fatty acids that modern nutritionists prize so highly. The fish is not necessarily less nutritious than the meat it replaces, and it may well be more so, but there is something else happening here, something about human psychology and the meaning of food. When meat is forbidden, it becomes more desirable. When Lent finally ends at Easter, the return to meat eating feels like a genuine celebration. The Easter feast, with its lamb or kid or whatever meat the family can afford, tastes better because of the 40 days of abstinence that preceded it. Deprivation creates appreciation in ways that constant availability never can. Medieval people understand this intuitively. The cycle of feast and fast gives shape to the year, creates rhythms that make time feel meaningful rather than just an endless succession of days. Christmas is joyous, partly because Advent was austere. Easter is celebratory, partly because Lent was limiting. The return to butter and eggs and cheese after weeks without them feels like a gift, even though these are ordinary foods available for most of the year. The feast days themselves offer something special. Moments when even peasant tables might hold foods that rarely appear in daily life. Christmas might bring a goose, saved and fattened for this purpose. Easter might feature eggs coloured with natural dyes, their prohibition during Lent making them feel festive and special. Harvest festivals celebrating the successful gathering of grain might include meat pies or better beer or white bread made from wheat instead of the usual barley or rye. These feast days matter enormously to people whose daily lives offer few pleasures and little variation. A special meal becomes a memory that sustains through ordinary days, a bright spot in a year that might otherwise feel grinding and endless. The anticipation of Christmas dinner or the harvest feast provides something to look forward to, a reward for labour and sacrifice. But the fasting days matter too, in different ways. They create solidarity, a sense that everyone is participating in the same sacrifice at the same time. When the whole village abstains from meat during Lent, no one feels singled out or deprived. The shared limitation becomes communal discipline, religious observance that binds people together in common purpose. For women managing households, the religious calendar creates both challenges and structure. They must know what can be served on which days, must plan meals around the requirements of the church calendar, as well as the availability of ingredients. During Lent, creativity becomes essential. How do you make pottage interesting when you cannot use butter or add an egg to enrich it? The answer lies in herbs and vegetables, in careful seasoning with the limited spices available, in presentation and variety even within narrow constraints. Some women become expert at these variations, earning reputations for making fish days less tedious, for finding ways to make permitted foods satisfying and even delicious. Their knowledge is practical theology, understanding the rules well enough to work within them creatively. They know which mushrooms can be gathered to add substance to Lenten pottage. They know how to cook dried peas so they become creamy and rich without any dairy. They know which herbs will make stockfish taste less aggressively fishy. The rules themselves create interesting questions and controversies. What exactly counts as fish? The medieval definition is broader than ours, based on theology rather than biology. Anything that lives in water can be considered fish for fasting purposes. This means that beavers with their scaly tails and aquatic habits are sometimes classified as fish. Barnacle geese, believed to develop from barnacles in the sea, might also qualify. Puffins found near water and feeding on fish could be fish rather than fowl, depending on who you asked. These classifications are not merely academic, they determine what can be eaten when, and peasants who live near water might have access to waterfowl or other semi-aquatic animals that occupy this ambiguous category. The local priest might rule one way or another, and neighbouring villages might follow different interpretations. This creates a certain flexibility in the system, room for local tradition and practical accommodation. Baby rabbits, impossibly young, are sometimes classified as fish, in a bit of theological reasoning that seems tortured to modern minds but made sense to medieval thinkers. The reasoning went something like this. Very young animals, still essentially embryonic, partake of the nature of the womb that formed them rather than having independent animal nature. If rabbits are kept in warrens, semi-aquatic enclosures, then perhaps these youngest rabbits are not quite land animals yet, therefore fish. The monks who raised rabbits for meat during Lent appreciated this classification, whether they entirely believed the reasoning or simply found it convenient. But most peasants are not concerned with these edge cases. They eat stockfish and herring on fish days because those are what they can afford and access. They eat no eggs or dairy during Lent because the rules are clear and the social pressure to comply is enormous. They break their fast at Easter with whatever their resources permit, grateful for the return to normal eating even if normal is not particularly luxurious. The impact on health is complex and probably varied by individual circumstance. Forcing people to eat fish regularly might have provided nutrients they would otherwise lack. But the prohibition on eggs and dairy during Lent eliminated important sources of protein and vitamins, especially in late winter when stored vegetables are running low and fresh greens have not yet appeared. Some people probably suffered nutritional deficits during the strictest fasting periods. Others might have benefited from the enforced variety, the requirement to eat fish and legumes instead of relying entirely on bread and pottage. What is certain is that the religious calendar made diet more varied than it would otherwise have been. Without the requirement to eat fish on Fridays, some families might never have eaten fish at all, especially those living far from water. Without the prohibition on meat during Lent, there would be less incentive to develop creative uses for vegetables and legumes. The restrictions forced diversification, compelled people to find ways to make different foods satisfying, created knowledge about cooking and preservation that might not have developed in a world without these constraints. And the psychological effect of the feast and fast cycle should not be underestimated. Modern people, with constant access to every kind of food regardless of season, sometimes struggle to feel truly satisfied. When you can have anything anytime, nothing feels special. Medieval people, with their enforced rhythms of restriction and celebration, might have experienced more genuine satisfaction from simple foods because those foods were not always available. The first eggs after Lent tasted better than any egg tastes to someone who eats them whenever desired. The church bells ring again, marking the hour for prayer and also, indirectly, marking the hour for eating or abstaining. The calendar governs everything, when to plant and when to harvest, when to celebrate and when to mourn, when to feast and when to fast. And for peasants living close to the edge of subsistence, these rhythms provide structure and meaning in lives that might otherwise feel like nothing but unrelenting labour. They eat fish on Friday because the church says so, but also because the rhythm of fish on Friday creates a predictability that is comforting in an unpredictable world. They fast during Lent because theology demands it, but also because the shared sacrifice creates community in a way that individual choice never could. They feast at Easter because Christ rose from the dead, but also because 40 days of limitation make the return to abundance feel like resurrection of a more immediate and tangible kind. The religious calendar, with all its restrictions and requirements, shapes the medieval diet as powerfully as climate or economy. It determines not just what is eaten, but when and why, transforming meals from mere fuel into acts of devotion, discipline, and community. And in doing so, it creates patterns of eating that are more varied, more seasonal, and possibly more nutritious than they would have been in a world where choice was the only governing principle. The sun sets on another Friday. The pottage tonight contains fish instead of meat, stockfish laboriously beaten and soaked until it's softened enough to eat. The taste is strong, the texture is stringy, and no one would call this a luxury. But bellies are full, The religious obligation is fulfilled, and tomorrow is Saturday, and Sunday after that when the rules relax and perhaps there will be bacon in the pot again. The rhythm continues week after week, year after year, shaping lives and diets in ways that we, from our distance of centuries, can observe but perhaps never fully understand. The seasons turn like the great wheel they are named for, and with each turn the food on peasant tables changes completely. To speak of a medieval peasant diet as though it were one unchanging thing is to miss the most fundamental truth. What people ate in May bore almost no resemblance to what they ate in November, and both were different again from the sparse and careful eating of February. The rhythm of the agricultural year, the life cycle of plants and animals, the simple fact of living before refrigeration or global trade, all of this meant that food was profoundly, inescapably seasonal. Spring arrives slowly, grudgingly, in Northern Europe. February and March are the hungry months, the time when last year's stores run lowest, and this year's growth has barely begun. The grain stored after harvest has been eaten steadily through winter, and now the barrels and bins show their bottoms. The dried peas and beans, so plentiful in autumn, have dwindled to handfuls. The salted pork from November's pig slaughter is nearly gone, or has been gone for weeks in poorer households. The cheese made in summer, when milk flowed abundantly, exists now only in hard rinds and scraped remnants. This is the hungry gap, and it tests every skill and resource a household possesses. The pottage becomes thinner, more water than substance. Bread might be stretched by adding ground-dried peas or beans to the flour, or even acorn flour if the previous autumn's harvest was especially bad. Every scrap of food is precious. Bones that have already been boiled for broth are boiled again, yielding weaker but still valuable liquid. Stale bread normally fed to pigs or chickens gets added to the pot to provide bulk. But even now, in the leanest time, there are green things if you know where to look. The first wild plants emerge despite the cold. Nettles pushing up through dead leaves, their young tops tender enough to eat once the sting is boiled away. Dandelion greens appear, bitter but edible and rich with vitamins that winter-weary bodies crave. Sorrel grows in damp places, its lemony tartness welcome after months of stored foods. Women and children gather these wild greens, knowing exactly where they grow and when they will be ready, filling baskets with leaves that will go into the pottage pot or be boiled separately and eaten with whatever fat remains from winter stores. These early greens are not just food, they are medicine, though no one would use that word. After months of eating stored grains and preserved meats, after weeks or months without fresh vegetables, human bodies become depleted. Gums grow spongy, wounds heal slowly. Energy flags beyond what mere hunger explains. These are the early signs of scurvy, of vitamin C deficiency, and the first fresh greens of spring reverse it with almost miraculous speed. Within days of eating nettles and dandelions, people feel better, stronger, more themselves. They attribute this to the changing season, to the warming air, to God's mercy. And perhaps they are right on all counts, even if the mechanism involves vitamins they have never heard of. By April, the garden plots that have lain dormant through winter begin to wake. The onions planted last autumn have survived the frost and send up green shoots. Leeks do the same. Both can be harvested young and eaten fresh, their sharpness a delicious change from the dull flavours of winter food. Parsley, which dies back in winter but does not die entirely, produces new leaves. Other herbs emerge from their dormancy, thyme and mint and sage, returning like old friends. The chickens, which slowed their egg production in winter's darkness, begin laying again as the days lengthen. Eggs appear on the table with increasing frequency, fried or boiled or added to pottage, their richness a reminder that abundance, while not here yet, is coming. The cow or goat, if the family has one, begins to produce milk more generously as fresh grass appears and her body recovers from winter's deprivation. May and June bring the first real plenty. Peas planted in early spring mature into sweet pods that can be eaten fresh, a treat after months of dried peas soaked and boiled into submission. Fresh peas taste nothing like dried ones. They are sweet and crisp, bursting with green flavour, good eaten raw straight from the garden or cooked only briefly to preserve their character. Children assigned to shell peas for cooking often eat as many as they shell, and mothers do not scold them too harshly, because fresh peas are abundant and the pleasure of eating them raw is worth the small loss to the cooking pot. Lettuce and other salad greens grow quickly in spring's mild temperatures. These are eaten fresh, dressed simply with oil if the household has any, or with vinegar made from ale or cider, or sometimes just with salt. The concept of a salad as we know it does not quite exist, but fresh greens are eaten, valued for their taste and for the way they make people feel better after the long winter. Herbs grow vigorously, and fresh herbs taste different than dried, brighter and more complex. The pottage pot benefits enormously from handfuls of fresh parsley, from sage leaves torn just before cooking, from thyme that still holds morning dew. The difference between winter pottage made with dried herbs and spring pottage made with fresh is the difference between memory and presence, between sustenance and satisfaction. By midsummer, the garden overflows. Cabbage heads grow large and tight. Turnips and carrots swell underground. Beans hang heavy on their vines. There is more than the household can eat fresh, and this is when preservation begins in earnest. Cabbage can be made into sauerkraut, shredded and packed with salt, until it ferments into something tangy in keeping. Beans are left to dry on the vine, the pods turning brown and papery, the beans inside hardening into forms that will last for years if kept dry. The chickens lay prolifically, more eggs than can be eaten fresh. Some are preserved in solutions of water and lime, a technique that seals the porous shells and keeps the eggs edible for months. Preserved eggs taste different than fresh, but they are still eggs. Still protein, still valuable for cooking or eating during the months when chickens slow their production. Berries ripen in hedgerows and forest edges. Strawberries first, small and intensely flavoured, nothing like the large, bland berries of modern commerce. Then raspberries, blackberries, blueberries depending on the region. Children gather these, eating most of them before they make it home, but bringing enough back that mothers can make preserves, if they have honey, or the rare luxury of sugar. More commonly, berries are eaten fresh while they last, a brief seasonal pleasure that makes the summer feel generous. Autumn is harvest time, the culmination of the year's work, and the determination of whether the next year will be prosperous or lean. The grain fields are cut with sickles and scythes, the stalks bundled into sheaves, the sheaves stacked to dry. This is communal work, with everyone in the village participating according to their age and strength. The grain must be harvested when it is ready, which means long days of back-breaking labour, but also means that there is food and drink provided, sometimes better than usual, and a sense of shared accomplishment when the last sheaf is brought in. Once dried, the grain is threshed to separate seeds from stalks, winnowed to blow away the chaff, and stored in barns and bins. How much grain there is determines everything about the coming year. A good harvest means full bellies and some to sell at market. A poor harvest means careful rationing and anxiety about whether stores will last until next year's crop comes in. September and October bring the pig slaughter, as already described, and also the harvest of the last garden vegetables. Turnips and parsnips are dug up and stored in pits or root cellars. Cabbages are cut and stored or made into sauerkraut. Onions are dried and hung in bunches. Apples, if there are fruit trees, are picked, some eaten fresh, some stored in cool places where they will keep for months, some pressed for cider that will ferment into a mildly alcoholic drink, safer and more nutritious than water. This is the season of plenty, when tables are full and work is hardest. The harvest festivals that mark this time are both celebration and necessary respite, moments to acknowledge the year's bounty before winter closes in. The food served at harvest festivals might include fresh meat, white bread made from wheat instead of barley or rye, pies filled with fruit or meat or both. These are rare treats made possible by the harvest abundance and made meaningful by their rarity. Winter brings a return to stored foods. Fresh vegetables disappear from the diet, except for the hardy cabbages and leeks that can survive light frosts. The pottage pot contains dried peas and beans, preserved pork or salt fish, roots pulled from storage pits. Bread is made from grain stored after the harvest, its quality depending on how well the grain was protected from moisture and pests. Cheese made in summer is eaten, growing harder and stronger flavoured with age. Salted butter, packed away months ago, provides fat for cooking. This is not a time of starvation, assuming the harvest was adequate, but it is a time of monotony. The same foods appear day after day with little variation. Pottage in the morning, bread and cheese at midday, pottage again in the evening. The flavours are familiar to the point of tedium. The textures never vary. And yet this food keeps people alive and working through the cold months when nothing grows and most animals sleep. The seasonal variation in diet means that nutrition varies too. Summer and autumn, with their abundance of fresh vegetables and fruits, provide vitamins that winter cannot match. Even when stored carefully, dried foods lose nutritional value over time. Vitamin C, so abundant in fresh greens, largely disappears from the winter diet, returning only with spring's first wild plants. This creates a yearly cycle of relative plenty and relative deficiency that shapes health in ways medieval people observe without understanding. They know that people sicken more in late winter. They know that the first spring greens make people feel better. They know that harvest time, for all its hard work, is when people seem strongest and most energetic. They attribute this to the seasons themselves, to the humours and elements that medieval medicine uses to explain health and illness. They are not entirely wrong, even if the vocabulary is different from what modern nutrition would use. The seasonal rhythm also creates anticipation and appreciation. Strawberries in June taste better because they have not been available for 11 months and will not be available again for another 11. Fresh peas in May are a delight because the memory of dried peas from winter makes the contrast stark and wonderful. Even the return to pottage made with fresh herbs instead of dried marks a turning point, a moment when winter's end becomes real in the mouth and belly. Modern people, accustomed to eating strawberries in January and fresh greens year-round, have lost this rhythm. We gain constant availability but lose seasonal anticipation. Medieval peasants had no choice in the matter. They ate what was available when it was available, but there might have been a kind of satisfaction in that, a harmony with natural cycles that we have traded away for convenience. The seasons turn, spring's hunger gives way to summer's abundance. Autumn's harvest is followed by winter's careful rationing, and through it all peasant families eat what the season provides, preserving what they can for leaner times, gathering wild foods to supplement cultivated ones, adapting their meals to the endless cycle of growth and dormancy that governs all life in the agricultural world. They do not choose this rhythm, but they live within it skillfully, their knowledge of seasons and foods keeping them fed through the turning year. The fire burns low, embers glowing softly in the darkness. Outside, the village sleeps under a sky brilliant with stars that medieval people know by name and story, constellations that mark the seasons as surely as the foods that appear and disappear from their tables. Inside this small cottage, the pottage pot still hangs over the coals, ready for tomorrow's meal. The bread wrapped in cloth will be breakfast. The garden outside waits for morning's tending. And in this quiet moment it is worth stepping back to see the whole picture of how medieval peasants actually ate. They ate better than we have been told, not luxuriously, not with the variety and abundance that modern grocery stores provide, not without hunger and hardship and seasonal deprivation, but better than the gruel and misery of old stories, better than the nearly meatless existence that folklore insists upon, better, in some ways that matter, than their wealthy lords who feasted on refined white bread and excessive amounts of meat. The archaeological evidence is clear and growing clearer with each new analysis. Those cooking pots from West Cotton and similar sites across medieval England show chemical traces of beef and mutton, of dairy products, of the vegetables that grew in every garden plot. These were not occasional treats leaving faint signatures, but regular foods cooked often enough to permanently mark the porous ceramic. Peasants were eating meat, they were eating dairy, they were eating vegetables seasoned with herbs from their gardens. They were eating, in other words, varied and reasonably nutritious diets that supported the enormous physical labour their lives demanded. The numbers tell part of the story. A prosperous peasant might consume 3,500 to 4,500 calories per day, closely matching the 4,000 to 5,000 calories they burned through heavy agricultural labour. They were eating 2 to 3 pounds of bread daily, 8 ounces of meat or fish or other protein, vegetables from their gardens, dairy products when available. This is not starvation. This is not the desperate poverty that popular imagination has assigned to medieval peasants. The quality tells another part, that dark, coarse bread made from barley or rye or maslin. The bread that peasants ate because they could not afford refined white flour was actually more nutritious than the prestigious white bread of the wealthy. Whole grains, with their bran and germ intact, provided fibre, vitamins and minerals that refined flour lacked entirely. The peasant eating brown bread was getting better nutrition than the lord eating white, though neither knew it, and the lord would have been horrified at the suggestion. The salmon that peasants caught in rivers and sometimes tired of eating provides omega-3 fatty acids that modern nutritionists consider essential. The fresh vegetables from gardens provided vitamins. The herbs added not just flavour but nutrients and compounds that, while not understood in medieval terms, genuinely supported health. The variety imposed by seasons and religious fasting annoying as it must have been, forced dietary diversity that might not have existed otherwise. This does not mean medieval peasant life was easy or pleasant. The hungry gap in late winter was real and dangerous. Bad harvests brought genuine hardship, sometimes starvation. The constant labour required to produce this food was backbreaking and endless. The social structure that demanded peasants pay portions of everything they produced to lords and church was exploitative by any reasonable measure. Disease and early death were common. Life expectancy was short by modern standards. But within these constraints, peasants were not merely surviving, they were eating meals that satisfied and nourished. They were using skill and knowledge passed through generations to transform simple ingredients into food that sustained families and communities. They were demonstrating a resourcefulness and competence that deserves recognition rather than the condescending pity that history has too often offered. The women who tended gardens and managed households, who knew which herbs would flavour pottage and which would soothe illness, who could transform milk into cheese that would last through winter and vegetables into preserves that extended summer's abundance. These women were experts in their domain. Their knowledge was practical and essential, though it was never written down and their names appear in no records. The men who worked the fields and tended animals, who knew when to plant and when to harvest, who could judge the quality of grain and the health of livestock, they too possessed expertise that kept communities fed year after year despite challenges that would defeat those without such knowledge. The children who gathered wild greens in spring and berries in summer, who helped in gardens and learned by watching and doing how to produce food and prepare it. They were receiving an education as valuable as any book learning, though it would never be recognized as such. And the food itself, that pottage simmering endlessly over the fire, that dark bread baked in communal ovens, those vegetables and herbs and bits of meat and fish and dairy, all of it tells a story different from the one we have been telling. It tells a story of adequacy rather than deprivation, of skill rather than deprivation, of people who ate reasonably well within the constraints their world imposed. Modern people sometimes romanticize medieval peasant diets, imagining them as pure and natural and somehow more authentic than our processed industrial food system. This too is a distortion. Medieval peasants would have gladly traded their dark bread for white if they could afford it. They would have chosen more meat and more variety if those choices existed. They were not eating whole grains and vegetables by preference but by necessity. Yet there is something to learn from how they ate. Not because medieval life was better, but because the constraints they lived under forced solutions that sometimes worked well. They wasted almost nothing because they could not afford to waste anything. They ate seasonally because no other option existed. They preserved food carefully because winter was coming and would be long and hard. They valued the foods they had access to and used them skillfully. The pottage pot that simmers through this entire story is the perfect symbol. It is humble, ordinary, made from cheap clay, but it holds everything: grains and vegetables, herbs and meat, the work of hands and the passage of seasons, hunger and satisfaction, survival and sometimes even pleasure. It is never the same twice, changing with what is available and what is needed, adapting endlessly to circumstance. And perhaps that adaptability, that skill at making do with what is at hand, that knowledge of how to transform simple ingredients into nourishment, perhaps that is what we should remember most about how medieval peasants ate. Not that they ate poorly, because they often did not. Not that they ate well by modern standards, because those standards are unfair to apply, but that they ate skillfully, knowledgeably, making the most of what their world provided. The fire will be banked soon, coals buried in ash to keep their heat until morning. The household will sleep and wake, and eat bread and perhaps some cheese, and go to work in the fields or garden or wherever labour calls. Tomorrow's pottage is already begun, waiting only for fresh water and whatever the day provides. And in that continuation, that endless cycle of cooking and eating and working and cooking again, there is a kind of triumph. They survived. They fed their families. They passed their knowledge to the next generation. They lived lives that were hard but not hopeless, poor but not destitute, limited but not without satisfaction. And they ate better than we have given them credit for, which seems like a small thing to acknowledge but is not. It is in fact a restoration of dignity to people who have been diminished by history's assumptions. So let us leave them here, in this cottage with its banked fire and sleeping household, its pot ready for tomorrow's meal, its garden waiting outside. They do not need our pity. They might benefit from our respect. And perhaps in our own world of abundance and waste and disconnection from the sources of our food, We might learn something from their necessity-driven wisdom about seasons and preservation, about using everything and wasting nothing, about the satisfaction that comes from food carefully prepared and gratefully eaten. The story of how medieval peasants ate is not finally a story about deprivation. It is a story about competence and adaptation, about skill and knowledge, about making life work within constraints that seem impossible until you watch people actually do it, day after day, generation after generation. They ate, they survived, they sometimes even thrived. And the food that made this possible, simple food, humble food, skillfully prepared, deserves to be remembered for what it actually was, rather than what we assumed it must have been. The pot simmers on, the bread waits for morning, the garden grows, and life continues, nourished by knowledge and work and the endless human capacity to make something from what is at hand. That is the real story of how medieval peasants ate, and it is a better story than the one we have been telling.